Meet Dr. Benjamin Franklin, our most accomplished, most accessible, and most paradoxical founding father. He was the entire package: scientist, inventor, journalist, businessman, and statesman.
I became convinced that Benjamin Franklin was the great American genius.
His achievements were unparalleled. He was the driving force behind America's first public lending library, first non-religious college, and first national newspaper. As a diplomat, he helped make American independence a reality.
Next to George Washington, Benjamin Franklin is probably the most indispensable person when it comes to winning the revolution.
And in matters of science, he was nothing less than the greatest thinker of his time.
We can certainly compare Franklin's work with electricity with the Wright brothers' work with aviation.
Beyond his greatness, however, there was another side to Benjamin Franklin. And that side doesn't always show up in the history books.
Throughout his life, Franklin's governed by sexual passions, he says.
We're not talking about a guy who's some moral superstar here.
Franklin wasn't above engaging in dirty tricks against his opponents.
And if he could be said to have a great failing, I think it's probably in his family relations that it's most clear.
For more than 200 years, Ben Franklin has inspired and confounded us. He has been analyzed, criticized, and scrutinized by an army of biographers. Yet the essence of the man remains elusive.
Benjamin Franklin's the founding father who winks at us. You know, he lets us in on the joke a bit.
Ben Franklin, it turns out, is everything we think he is, and a lot more that we never imagined. For someone who has been a national icon for well over 200 years, Benjamin Franklin remains surprisingly enigmatic. His long public life and prolific writings present us with a maze of different personas. At times, Franklin is diplomatic, at others, skeptical. He can be flirtatious, wary, conciliatory, witty, or maddeningly patient. He is rarely stubborn, usually wise, often candid, and, whenever necessary, artfully evasive. The doorway into this hall of mirrors is Franklin's autobiography, which he began writing at the age of 65.
The autobiography tells us not who Franklin was, which is how many people have read it, but how Franklin saw himself, and more importantly, how he wished others to see him.
Benjamin Franklin was the first great publicist and image maker in America, and the greatest image he created was of himself.
And I think that Franklin is a master of masks. Franklin understood that American life is one great masquerade ball.
Benjamin Franklin arrived at the party in January of 1706. He was born in a modest home in Boston, Massachusetts, the 10th boy of 17 children. By the age of 16, Ben was already showing a genius for subterfuge. An apprentice printer, he was indentured to his brother James, publisher of a newspaper called the New England Courant.
He wants to write for his brother's newspaper. But his brother's an older brother and, you know, sort of jealous. So James Franklin is having none of that. So Benjamin Franklin has to disguise his handwriting and slip these essays under the door under a pseudonym. And here's a kid who's never left Boston, writing as if he's a widowed older woman from the countryside named Silence Dogood.
He's adopted the persona of this middle-aged woman, and he's able to carry it off so convincingly that it fools his own brother.
I have now remained in a state of widowhood for several years, wrote Mrs. Dogood, a state I never much admired. I could be persuaded to marry again, provided I was sure of a good-humored, sober, agreeable companion, but one even with these few good qualities being hard to find, I have lately relinquished all thoughts of that nature. The public was delighted with Silence Dogood. James, however, was not amused when he learned her true identity. In the end, Ben ran away from his apprenticeship, his family, and Boston. He ended up in Philadelphia.
Benjamin Franklin was a runaway. He was a fugitive from his apprenticeship, which made him a fugitive from justice. And Philadelphia was a place that took in people like that and allowed them to find a niche and to flourish.
At the time of his arrival, Franklin does not exactly exude an aura of success. He's 17 years old. He has no job, no prospects, and just enough money to buy a few rolls of bread. It happens that he strolls past the home of a young woman named Debbie Reed, who is destined to be his wife.
And according to the story that he tells, she was standing in the door of her father's house on Market Street when this rather scruffy-looking character walks past with his dirty linen hanging out of his pockets and munching on a couple of rolls, which is all he had money to buy for breakfast.
Franklin described the scene in his autobiography. She, standing at the door, saw me and thought I made, as I certainly did, a most awkward, ridiculous appearance. It is difficult to imagine George Washington or Thomas Jefferson portraying themselves in such an inglorious farce.
He's very self-aware, very introspective, but he finds himself amusing in a way. And you can see the old man writing the autobiography and being amused by his younger self. So it's a very funny guy who's looking at himself and laughing part of the time.
There was plenty to laugh about. For 7 years, Ben knocked around Philadelphia and London, working as a journeyman printer and getting in and out of scrapes. He feuds with an overbearing employer, makes a play for his best friend's girl, and gets stiffed on a few sizable but ill-considered loans.
His endless brushes with human nature through the first section of the autobiography, that is one long account of America's first juvenile delinquent. And he scams other people scam him, and out of all of this, he comes away with a very considerable appreciation of what you can expect from others and a very considerable self-knowledge.
It is during these early years that we first encounter Ben's enduring enthusiasm for the company of women.
You know, we often think of Benjamin Franklin as this doddering old sage. But when he was a young tradesman in Philadelphia, he was, quite a good-looking guy. He was 6 feet tall. He was a great swimmer. He lifted weights. He loved dumbbells. He was, had a big, broad chest. Women, fell in love with him all the time. So he was a great hunk back then when he was in Philadelphia.
By his own testimony in his autobiography, Franklin had a lively libido. And before he was married, he consorted with what he called low women. He was evidently engaged with prostitutes.
Ben put it this way: that hard-to-be-governed passion of youth hurried me frequently into intrigues with low women, which were attended with some expense and a continual risk to my health.
And he reports to us that it's a stone miracle that he didn't come down with syphilis or some other venereal disease.
He didn't recommend it to people, but on the other hand, he didn't especially condemn it in himself. He recognized it was part of human nature, at least his human nature.
Franklin was all too familiar with his nature, both strengths and weaknesses. During those first years in Philadelphia, he had embarked on a quest for what he called moral perfection.
He compiles from his reading a list of what he accepts to be 12 common virtues: modesty, frugality, industry, moderation, temperance, chastity. And then he defines each of these terms and sets for himself the task of conquering each one in the course of a week.
He even makes a chart where he lists them all and marks how well he does, and it's industry and frugality and all these virtues.
I think he was hopeful that he could be incrementally better, that it wouldn't do any harm to have a little bit of a run at modesty. It wouldn't do any harm to have a little bit of a run at temperance. He never says, lay off the sauce. He always says, less.
In his autobiography, Ben admits with some bemusement that the project was probably doomed from the start. While my attention was taken up in guarding against one fault, I was often surprised by another. Habit took advantage of inattention. Inclination was sometimes too strong for reason.
When he finally gave up on the whole scheme, he realized that if he had become morally perfect, he would have sinned against the last item on the list, humility, because he would have been too full of himself, having achieved perfection.
And as Franklin himself puts it, and this really tells us everything we need to know about Franklin the self-improver, I could not boast of having accomplished humility, but I have made a good stab at putting up appearances.
By 1730, Franklin's virtues, such as they were, and his indisputable talents, had elevated him from journeyman printer to owner of his own shop. Now 24, he was also the publisher of a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. With his social position improving, Franklin thought it was high time to settle down, though for more than the usual reasons. His intrigues with low women had resulted in the birth of a son, William. Debbie Reed, who had once been the object of Ben's romantic attentions, was willing to overlook William's origins and Ben's youthful indiscretions. Shortly after the child was born, she and Benjamin settled into a common-law marriage. During the following years, Franklin worked hard and paid dutiful attention to appearances. In every sense, Benjamin Franklin was becoming a self-made man.
He actually did work long hours, but he took pains so that people saw him working long hours. They knew that if they gave a job to Franklin, Franklin would get to the shop early, he would work late to make sure that it was done on time. Franklin recognized that to be a success, he had to be good at what he did, but he also had to be seen to be good at what he did. And he was a master at both ends of that.
He cares about the image. He's always polishing his image. He rolls the carts of paper when he's a young printer in Philadelphia up and down the streets so people will see he's industrious. And throughout his life, he's creating this image of the frugal, hardworking tradesman.
In 1733, Franklin created yet another image for himself as Richard Saunders, publisher of Poor Richard's Almanac.
Now, everybody who cared to know certainly knew it was Benjamin Franklin, but it was a different name. And so when he published as Poor Richard, he could say things that he didn't want to say as Benjamin Franklin. It was as though this other side of Benjamin Franklin was just dying to get out.
Early on, Poor Richard had to contend with a rival almanac that had been established for some 20 years. Ben was determined to take his share of the market.
I don't think Franklin makes any secret of the fact that he's a deeply ambitious man. He's really a bundle of ambition. And he will proceed sometimes in a rather stealthy way to achieve those ends.
Franklin wasn't above engaging in what we might call dirty tricks against his opponents. At one point, he even claimed that a competing almanac maker had died.
The rival publisher, of course, was very much alive, but readers delighted in Ben's irreverence. Readers also loved the regular installments of Poor Richard's Proverbs, sayings that ring as true today as they did when Franklin wrote them more than 2 centuries ago.
Many of Franklin's sayings were the sort of thing that were taught to generations of school children. A penny saved is a penny earned. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Others have not been so commonly repeated because they appeal to an earthier sense of humor. So Franklin had one saying, force on reason's back. Well, it's another way of saying might makes right.
Franklin sold a phenomenal 10,000 almanacs each year, a circulation equal to nearly 3 million today. Ben, however, had still bigger plans for his printing business.
Like a great tycoon, he starts franchising these print shops up and down the coast. All of his relatives and apprentices from Boston down to Barbados have these print shops where he takes a 50% equity stake.
He would send out printers, and he would enter into a partnership with them. He would provide the inventory, he would provide the equipment, they would do the labor, and they would split the profits.
Franklin's media empire was a stunning success. From his arrival as a penniless runaway, he had remade himself into one of Philadelphia's most distinguished citizens. Benjamin Franklin's efforts at improvement did not end with himself, however. He would also be the driving force behind radical social innovations that still have an impact on Americans in the 21st century.
For very many people, Benjamin Franklin is their favorite founding father. I think this reflects the fact that Franklin, in his temperament and his outlook, is the one that's easiest to imagine living at the beginning of the 21st century. George Washington in the year 2004, 2005, that would be a tough one. Thomas Jefferson may be easier. Benjamin Franklin would be really easy.
It's so easy to imagine Benjamin Franklin in modern-day America because modern-day America was markedly shaped by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's imprint on the civic life of the country can be traced at least as far back as 1727, when he organized a small social club, the Junto. The 12-member group, which met every Friday evening in a local tavern, included a cobbler, a clerk, a cabinet maker, and several printers.
The Junto is a group of apprentices, journeymen, all of them clearly smart, ambitious, young kids on the make, looking to advance themselves in the Philadelphia economy.
Franklin very much believes in self-improvement for what he calls we the middling people. In fact, he says you can't trust the elite or the establishment or the crown to protect our rights. It's up to we the middling people.
You could call it a seminar of self-improvement. The people who were part of this seminar, part of this discussion club, were people who were in a similar situation as Franklin. And for the most part, they didn't have formal schooling, but they were very interested in educating themselves.
That's not to say Ben and his cohorts were all work and no play. The Junto meetings were lubricated with alcohol and punctuated by drinking songs.
Franklin loved to sing. He wrote about 8 songs, some better than others, I have to say. But his favorite activity was sitting in a small, intimate setting with friends of his, a club, a tavern, a living room, and singing with his friends.
In between songs, Franklin and the Junto hatched plans that would change the world. They helped establish Philadelphia's first volunteer fire department and the first non-religious college in America, the Philadelphia Academy. It survives today as the University of Pennsylvania. Among their greatest achievements was the creation of America's first public lending library, the Library Company of Philadelphia. Thanks to the Junto, books would no longer be the exclusive domain of the wealthy and well-connected.
They were simply trying to improve themselves. But in breaking down this fundamental barrier of class that had separated the uneducated from the educated, the wealthy from the people with lesser resources, they made it possible for people like Franklin, who should have had no business engaging in political discussions, philosophical discussions at a very high level, to do exactly that. And it's this class that's going to spearhead the American Revolution in the 1760s and 1770s.
For Benjamin Franklin, the maneuvering required by public life was in itself an education, a master's degree in human nature and gamesmanship. Life is a kind of chess, he wrote, in which we have points to gain and competitors to contend with. By playing at chess, we learn not to make our moves too hastily. Some of Ben's most calculated moves pertain to matters of religion. For starters, he had to learn to navigate between Philadelphia's various congregations.
You've got to understand what the Presbyterians like. You've got to understand what the Quakers like, though the Presbyterians and the Quakers hate each other. And if you're going to be the kind of a cultural broker that Franklin was, you can't be one or the other of those.
Though nominally a Presbyterian himself, Ben had ties to Christ Church, an Anglican congregation. It was all part of the game.
If you go into Christ Church today, you'll see a very large, prominent pew, which is marked as the pew of the Franklin family, which is weird because Franklin was not an Anglican, not an Episcopalian as we would now call them. But Franklin thought that it was politic to have a pew in Christ Church, which was the church of the richest denomination, the most socially prestigious denomination in the city.
Ben's ties to organized religion extended beyond Christ Church.
During his lifetime, Franklin donated to the building fund of each and every church built in Philadelphia. He's one of the largest individual contributors to the first synagogue built in Philadelphia.
He thought religions all did good, and he cared not a fig about their doctrinal differences, but he was perfectly willing to support civic institutions that ameliorated the life of his fellow citizens.
While being a friend to all of Philadelphia's religions, Ben also nurtured his own beliefs.
Franklin was very clear about religion. He feels that there is a God, and God has created the world and is to be worshipped, that the best way one can worship God is by doing good among men.
Doing good was a favorite strategy of Ben's, especially in that murky area where civic duty also promoted personal gain.
Poor Richard had a wonderful saying called about doing well by doing good, which meant you could serve your community but also do well by yourself. And that was really Franklin's creed.
In 1736, a few years after opening his print shop, Franklin becomes clerk of the Pennsylvania Assembly. Through his position, he secures a lucrative contract printing the Assembly proceedings.
The standards of conflict of interest were a lot looser back then. I mean, nowadays we're kind of shocked if a Halliburton gets a large number of contracts and works with the government and, you know, looks like insider dealings and stuff like that. But back then it was pretty natural that a person who was a civic leader could also do well in his business through his civic work.
Franklin also served the British Crown as a royal deputy postmaster.
Franklin had the responsibility of improving the postal service throughout the American colonies, and he did a wonderful job at this. The delivery of mail, in fact, around the colonies from Philadelphia to New York in the 18th century was faster than delivery of mails is today.
But Franklin's postal innovations also helped himself. He could now be secure that his newspaper was widely distributed across the colonies.
As the proprietor, the printer, the editor, publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, he quite commonly reported news from other colonies. The faster the news got from Boston to Philadelphia, the faster the news got from Charlestown to Philadelphia, the sooner he could get it in the paper and the more valuable his paper would be. The Pennsylvania Gazette became, in essence, the New York Times of its day.
By the time he was 40, Benjamin Franklin was becoming a household name across the colonies. It would be Franklin's discoveries about electricity, however, that propelled him to international stardom as an American Prometheus, the man who tamed lightning. Ben Franklin hardly qualifies as a hippie. He didn't exactly turn on and drop out, but he did reach a stage in life when he decided to quit working and have more fun.
Franklin is sometimes held up as the archetype of the American capitalist, the self-made man who succeeds in business. And to a certain extent he was, but he was much more than a capitalist. Franklin retired from business at the age of 42. Why? Because he had enough. There were other things he wanted to do with his time.
I shall like to give myself leisure to read, study, make experiments, and converse at large with such ingenious and worthy men as are pleased to honor me with their friendship. Franklin sold his business, keeping a share of the profits to fund his retirement. Then he unleashed his inventive imagination.
Franklin was a great inventor, and it starts as a little kid. He teaches himself how to swim by looking at books about it, and then he wants to swim faster, so he invents flippers and fins and stuff like that. And then even faster, he strips, jumps into Boston Harbor, and takes a kite, so he's pulled across Boston Harbor with a kite.
Franklin's inventiveness, Franklin's curiosity was just like the Energizer Bunny. It never stopped. It was always churning.
Franklin never went anywhere, never did anything without looking around and asking himself, what is going on? Why is this so?
Franklin's questions, and more importantly, his answers, fueled a lifetime of remarkable discoveries. During a transatlantic voyage, Ben becomes curious about anomalies in ocean temperatures and ends up charting what we now know as the Gulf Stream. After calculating the physics of heat radiation and convection currents, Ben designs the most efficient home heating device of the 18th century, the Franklin stove. When Ben becomes fed up changing between reading glasses and distance glasses, he mounts half of each lens in both sides of his frames. He calls the design double spectacles. Today, we call them bifocals. Few inventors can boast such a string of #1 hits. But every now and then, Ben uncorked a complete and utter failure. Most notable, his phonetic alphabet. In Ben's plan, most of the 26 familiar letters are retained. But there are also 6 new letters, among them ing, ish, ed, and eth. This letter to a lady friend is one of the few that Franklin wrote using his phonetic alphabet. Soon after, he dropped the system, much to the relief of those on the receiving end of such messages.
After a while, he kind of gives up on the phonetic alphabet. Noah Webster picks it up, writes some articles about it and stuff, but Franklin realizes that he's never going to be able to push reform that far and get everybody to use a phonetic alphabet.
While the phonetic alphabet died a quiet, merciful death, another of Franklin's inventions was serenading audiences across Europe. Ben's musical instrument was a new spin on an old trick, rubbing the rims of crystal goblets to create musical tones.
What he did was to say, rather than rub your finger around the rim of 25 glasses, why not have the glasses turn and come to your fingers? And that's exactly what he did with the glass harmonica.
This is Ben's personal harmonica, built during the 1760s and housed today at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. Ben mounted 37 crystal bowls on an iron rod, which was then rotated by a foot pedal.
As the bowls turned in front of him, he would wet his fingers with water, and the friction produced by his fingertips on those bowls made that characteristic sound. Of all the things Franklin invented, this was his very favorite one.
While his harmonica brought him widespread acclaim during his lifetime, it was Franklin's work with electricity that would make him a legend for the ages.
Franklin came to electricity at a time when electricity was not quite a science. It was a curiosity. It was almost, well, often was, a vaudeville act.
After seeing one of these shows, Ben was hooked. He acquired this contraption, known as a Hauksbee generator. Its sole purpose was to create static electricity.
This Hauksbee generator is very similar to the kind of device Franklin used to generate electrical charges. This plastic drum will pick up electrical charges from this pad as I crank it. Those electrons will then be transferred through the brass fingers onto the collection cylinder and then out to the distribution point.
The charge can also be directed along a chain to a pair of metal dishes, where objects like styrofoam peanuts rise and fall in response to the invisible flow of electrons. Franklin performed a similar trick using a small spider made of fabric. Through simple experiments like these, Franklin develops his landmark theory of electricity. He begins with an entirely new terminology.
Battery, plus and minus, charge and discharge, things we normally use every day. Franklin was the first to use these words in relation to electricity.
Franklin's discovery of the single fluid theory of electricity, that electricity is a flow from positive to negative, is actually the most important discovery of that century. It compares to both Newton's theory of gravity in the century before and the theory of transistors and microchips in our own century, because it has very practical implications.
Franklin's most important contribution, however, and the one for which he is most known, was to demonstrate that lightning is, in fact, a form of electricity.
This flew directly in the face of the religious concepts at the time of thunderstorms. Lightning and thunder were definitely acts of God, even punishments of God.
Fires started by lightning could decimate entire towns. Single-handedly, Franklin would find a way to prevent these natural calamities.
Franklin devised a theory of electricity, how the particles in the atmosphere jostling around in a thunderstorm would create these charges, just like the ones in the laboratory. But most importantly, he devised a way to test it.
Franklin publishes his theories and a plan for testing them in 1751. In May of 1752, French scientists, following his instructions, are the first to prove conclusively that lightning is indeed nothing more than electricity. In June, before news arrives from France, Ben is ready to conduct his famous kite experiment. The concept seems simple today. A small wire on the kite will draw an electric charge from the clouds. The charge will then travel down a string to a key tied onto the line.
The small electric spark that he got from his kite through the key definitely showed him that lightning really was just the same static electricity he'd been experimenting with on a small scale, except this scale was absolutely enormous.
Within weeks, Franklin unveils his lightning rod, which remains the reliable way to channel a lightning bolt harmlessly into the ground. At the age of 46, Ben had secured his place in history.
There are a number of legacies left over by the Founding Fathers, but one of the most practical ones is the lightning rod created by Benjamin Franklin. Every building, every edifice in the world that stands at some height has one. And one might argue that without the lightning rod, tall buildings might not have come into existence.
Franklin was the one who, well, as people saw, or put it, tamed the lightning. He stole the lightning from the heavens. After Franklin's researches in electricity became known, he was one of the most famous people in the Western world.
He gets honorary degrees in Edinburgh and then at Oxford and Cambridge and eventually Yale and Harvard in the United States. And thereafter, he kind of allowed himself to be referred to as Dr. Franklin.
Though Ben enjoyed the worldwide acclaim, he refused to patent any of his inventions. He didn't earn a dime from the lightning rod or the stove, and that was just the way he wanted it.
He felt that he didn't need any more money, and it was far more important that he could simply contribute to the well-being of society. The lightning rod in particular, he felt was going to save lots of lives, save lots of homes and buildings from destruction. It was far more important to him that this invention be disseminated broadly than that he, Franklin, should turn a profit from it.
Ben's discoveries and inventions alone would probably have been enough to guarantee his lasting fame. But Ben Franklin's greatest achievement was still on the horizon. Challenging the political order and establishing American independence would become Franklin's most enduring legacy. Before he could raise the flag of rebellion, however, Benjamin Franklin would have to question his loyalty to the Crown of England. In short, he would have to question himself. These days, it seems the British royal family is a non-stop soap opera of petty rivalries, naughty scandals, and epic tragedy. The spectacle is of little consequence to most Americans. Of course, there was a time when the royals actually mattered. A time when Americans were British subjects, and no one was more devoted to the British crown than our own Benjamin Franklin.
He felt that the British Empire, politically speaking, was the best thing going. It afforded the greatest protection for rights, the greatest scope for individual ambitions and opportunities. Franklin eventually would be forced to change his mind, but it would require a real identity crisis in Franklin.
Ben's evolution from royalist to rebel would play out over some 30 years and mirror the changes that shaped America. From the 1740s to the early 1760s, Ben and his fellow colonists were staunchly British, fighting a common battle against France and its Indian allies in the wilds of North America. The conflicts culminated in what is known today as the French and Indian War. When French raiders penetrate to within 50 miles of Philadelphia, Franklin raises a militia to defend British interests. Later, he and his son William restore British control to frontier towns decimated by Indian attacks.
You don't think of Franklin as a military guy. But in the 1750s, when the Indians are terrorized, he and William go off to the frontier, and with this voluntary militia, they help build a line of forts that try to protect Pennsylvania from the marauding Indians.
In 1757, Franklin left the simmering conflict for London. He had been selected as the agent, or lobbyist, representing Pennsylvania's Assembly before Parliament. In addition to his official duties, Ben had personal business to attend to, business befitting a prominent citizen of the British Empire.
Franklin was very serious about getting a land grant in the West, and he brought together a lot of powerful political leaders and bankers of London into a syndicate that was going to try to get a land grant. So, as usual with Franklin, there's all sorts of interrelated and conflicting interests as he goes about his business.
Once in England, Franklin would even seek a post as Undersecretary of a British ministry. Larger events would force him to reconsider his allegiance. The catalyst was the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Britain had won, but its treasury was depleted.
The British had spent a lot of money defending the colonies in the French and Indian War, so they wanted to raise some taxes in order to pay for it. The Americans understood the need to help pay for these wars, but they wanted the right to impose their own taxes instead of having the Parliament in England impose the taxes.
The Stamp Act, passed in 1765, required Americans to pay taxes on just about every scrap of paper they used, from playing cards to court documents and newspapers. Franklin opposed the measure in principle, but did little to lobby against its passage.
At times, he wasn't fully aggressive enough. He didn't oppose the Stamp Act strongly enough for his constituents back in Pennsylvania because he saw himself as a loyal subject. He wanted a royal appointment. He wanted the land grant. And that, in some ways, helped separate him from the more radical sentiment back in the colonies.
The Stamp Act was greeted with outright violence, with acts of, well, what other people might call political terrorism. The stamp agents were in some cases tarred and feathered. The supporters of the British government had their houses torn down, and they themselves were sometimes ridden out of town on a rail. Franklin found himself caught out on the wrong foot here.
In America, Franklin's reputation plummeted. One political cartoon even depicted him as an agent of the devil.
Now, he quickly had to try to align himself a little bit more with what the position in America was, if only to be an effective mediator between the Americans and the British. But he still believed that reason could bring the two sides back together, because he thought it would be a tremendous shame and a great loss to Americans, to the British, to the world at large, if the British Empire fell apart.
On February 13, 1766, Franklin appears before Parliament and argues forcefully against the Stamp Act. 9 days later, Parliament rescinds the measure.
His testimony against the Stamp Act was the single most important thing that convinced the English government that it had to repeal the act. It also was the single most important thing to making Franklin the premier spokesman for the colonies and restoring his reputation back in America.
The Stamp Act episode left Franklin questioning his loyalties to England. Those doubts increased when Parliament instituted new taxes on the colonies.
The real issue was that in London, the colonies were perceived as subservient economically and politically. They were second-class citizens. They couldn't have their own manufacturing. They couldn't have their own power to tax without London's permission. And that was destined to cause a breach.
What began as a breach escalated into a disaster. On March 5, 1770, British soldiers gunned down 5 Americans during a sudden explosive street battle, the infamous Boston Massacre. Franklin was outraged, but he still believed relations between Britain and America could be saved. To continue his role as mediator, he accepted an offer to serve as agent for the Massachusetts Assembly, the motherlode of American defiance.
So he gets dragged in a radical direction by Samuel Adams and John Adams and the other leaders of the Massachusetts Assembly, and he also has to satisfy his Pennsylvania constituents as well. So he's trying to hold things together, but it becomes more and more difficult.
In late 1772, Franklin began to play a high-stakes game. He would crank up the political heat, but only against a limited political target, Thomas Hutchinson, Royal Governor of Massachusetts. Hutchinson and his lieutenant governor were bitter enemies of the Massachusetts Assembly. By means that still remain something of a mystery, Franklin obtained letters written by Hutchinson. In at least one, the governor urged Britain to curtail American liberties. Franklin sent the letters to an ally in Massachusetts.
What was his point? His point was to show that the laws that had been passed that seemed to infringe on the rights of Americans were not part of a grand conspiracy, but simply the work of a few bad apples.
What Franklin did was he took these letters and made them public, just the way Daniel Ellsberg, released the Pentagon Papers. It was trying to show what the government is doing. By opening up what the government was doing, it was going to explain things.
He hoped that the king would recall these officials, and that would allow the Americans, especially Massachusetts, but other radicals in America, to recognize, or at least to say that, okay, now we can essentially kiss and make up.
And as with the Pentagon Papers, it erupts into a huge scandal.
In London, Franklin found himself at the center of the storm. He was summoned to appear before the Privy Council, the king's highest-ranking advisors.
Just before Franklin arrives in the Privy Council, news of the Boston Tea Party arrives in London. And so now Franklin becomes, in essence, the scapegoat for all of the sins of the Americans over the last 10 years. The Stamp Act riots, everything leading up to this recent riot and destruction.
January 29th, 1774. Benjamin Franklin stands before the Privy Council in a hall known as the Cockpit, once a stage for bloody cockfights. The galleries are filled with members of Parliament and other dignitaries, most antagonistic to Franklin. Alexander Wedderburn, Solicitor General, speaks for Britain. He dresses down Franklin as he might a teenaged pickpocket.
And Franklin is realizing, I think now for the first time at a really personal level, the political has become personal. And Franklin must have been thinking, I'm always going to be treated as a second-class person simply because I'm an American. And as I see it, Franklin walked into the cockpit on that January morning in 1774, a Briton, and he walked out an American.
Franklin returned to Pennsylvania in time to help draft the Declaration of Independence. He had been a British subject for 70 years. Now, he declared himself an American.
This is a man who's committed to the British Empire, and several years later is completely committed to American independence. I don't think that there was anything wrong about that. I think the difference is that Franklin actually remains a thinking man, and thinking men find their ideas evolve and change.
Independence would require battling the greatest superpower on the face of the planet. But the United States had few weapons and little money. So Congress turned to the man who had plucked lightning from the heavens and asked him to perform another miracle, convince the King of France to bankroll the American Revolution. Guns, ammunition, soldiers, money. In 1776, the United States was desperately short on all counts, even as it was staring into the jaws of the world's mightiest superpower. George Washington had the unenviable job of molding farmers and merchants into a credible army. Benjamin Franklin set sail for Europe with an equally daunting challenge: convince the King of France to openly side with America against the British.
This was by no means an easy task. In the first place, the United States, even if the French recognized it as a legitimate country, was weak. There was absolutely no precedent for this sort of revolution to think that this new country could maintain its independence.
Franklin had no illusions about what was motivating the French. They were operating out of pure self-interest. They had an ancient rivalry with England. They had a peace of 1763 to seek their revenge for. They had no interest in American independence.
And complicating things even more was the fact that the independence of the United States was premised on something that was absolutely anathema to the French crown, namely revolting against and overthrowing your king.
In fact, the Declaration of Independence itself was banned in France. Selling an anti-royal uprising to King Louis XVI would test the limits of Ben Franklin's gamesmanship. Franklin knew he had little of substance to offer. His mere presence in France, however, became nothing less than a national holiday. The man who had tamed lightning was coming to Paris.
He was the star of his day. The closest analogy I can make to Franklin's arrival in Paris in 1776 was the arrival of the Beatles in New York in 1964.
And he is immediately the object of a sort of cult kind of worship. There are Franklin ashtrays and Franklin andirons, and there would be Franklin t-shirts if the idea had existed. There is Franklin wallpaper. It's an almost inescapable image.
Franklin himself was amused by the frenzy. "My portrait is a bestseller," he wrote to one of his children. "Your father's face is now as well known as that of the moon." Ben would leverage his unprecedented fame to put the squeeze on Louis XVI.
Louis XVI, the King of France, has to deal with growing discontent within his own country on the part of this rising bourgeoisie, the class that is going to take charge in the French Revolution. And Franklin takes pains to become as popular as possible with exactly this group.
There's no question that his prestige is one of the biggest weapons in America's arsenal.
So if King Louis then can't get along with Franklin, he risks not only alienating the Americans, but alienating this group that so loves Franklin.
Franklin quickly learns to play politics French style. He becomes a master of that uniquely Parisian institution, the salon. It is at these late-night dinner parties that the movers and shakers of French politics could themselves be shaken and moved.
So again, it's Franklin adapting. He realizes the pace of life is different. He realizes the approach to work is different. And he realizes that much is done on a very social platform.
Franklin was a salon superstar, primarily because he was witty and supremely accomplished. But Ben also dressed for success, one of the great masquerades of his career.
And he understood almost at once, almost intuitively, that the French would not be impressed with some pretender trying to dress as elegantly as they did. The way to their hearts was to be a simple backwoods Quaker. Franklin was never a Quaker. Franklin never lived anywhere near the backwoods in his entire life. But he began sending back to his buddies in Pennsylvania, "I need shipments of coonskin caps," and those ludicrous coonskin caps that he had never worn in his life. He begins wearing to every salon, to every public appearance. He played it to the hilt.
The French were enthralled. And as Franklin's fame grew, so did the envy of certain other Americans. In particular, Franklin's ease with Parisian women, whom he sometimes referred to as his mistresses, stands in stark contrast to the tortured efforts of John Adams, another member of the American delegation.
Franklin and Adams had two very different approaches to the French. You can even see it in the way they learned the French language. Franklin talks about how he learned to speak French by lounging on the pillows of his French mistresses, whereas Adams learned to speak French by memorizing a volume of French funeral orations. So they have a totally different style.
He speaks of Franklin's charm as if it ought to be a controlled substance or something. And there's almost an eternal friction between the sort of classic over and classic underachiever, between the class nerd and the most popular guy, between Adams and Franklin.
He goes to Paris and he discovers that Franklin is the lion of French society and Adams is a nothing. In fact, the people of Paris get him confused with Samuel Adams. And they're always, well, they end up just calling him the other Adams.
Even routine office work ended in fits of sputtering rage for the other Adams. John would be at work early, and Ben would stroll in at noon after a late night at the salon.
Adams thought it was ironic that the person who had spoken about early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, John Adams had grown up on Poor Richard's Almanac. And here was the author of Poor Richard's Almanac not following that kind of advice at all. But Franklin understood that he was actually getting more business done for the American mission at 2 o'clock in the morning in somebody's salon than Adams did at 8 o'clock in the morning in the office. That's simply the way the world of Parisian politics worked.
In Ben's view, John was a mixed blessing. He means well for his country, noted Franklin, and is always an honest man, but in some things, absolutely out of his senses. The French find Adams even more annoying. The foreign minister refuses to deal with him. It is Franklin who patiently works the French government for more than a year. In February of 1778, after learning of a significant American victory at Saratoga, Louis XVI finally signs on the dotted line.
Next to George Washington, Benjamin Franklin is probably the most indispensable person when it comes to winning the revolution.
Now, what had been a trickle of covert arms becomes a potent battlefield alliance. a steady stream of weapons and soldiers arrive in America.
France then provides 90% of the gunpowder we used in the Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette has almost as many French troops at Yorktown as George Washington has American troops. So that's what allows us to win the Revolution militarily.
Still, battlefield successes must be translated into diplomatic terms. After the decisive victory at Yorktown, Franklin and a team of American envoys would spend 2 years haggling with the British over details of a final peace treaty.
In the end, the British realized that it wanted to have America as an ally. And Franklin is able to play off Britain against France. So they're both competing to have better alliances with America, because they realize that America is going to be the great trading and economic partner in the new century. And it ends up with Franklin being able to make deals with both of them.
With the signing of the peace treaty in 1783, Benjamin Franklin had added diplomat to his long list of achievements. He was perhaps the most accomplished man in the world, a fact not lost on any number of women on 2 continents. One has only to peep through the keyhole of history to glimpse another facet of this remarkable man. You might say Ben Franklin was the 18th century's preeminent heartthrob. "Love me 1,000th part so well as I do you," urged one woman. Another confided, "You are the first man that ever received a private letter from me." Yet a third implored, "If it ever pleases you to remember the woman who loved you the most, think of me." The evidence is right there in black and white. Women loved Benjamin Franklin, and Ben returned the favor. Whether or not these affections crossed the line into naked passion makes for an alluring mystery. Was Benjamin Franklin an incurable romantic or a reckless womanizer?
Most people that I run into associate Franklin with innumerable bastard children fathered by innumerable women that he had his way with. The woman who studied this most closely finds virtually no evidence for any of it except his one illegitimate son whom he raised.
Throughout his life, Franklin's governed by sexual passions, he says, and he tries to tame them. He tries to tame them by getting married. And in some ways he does, but he still always loved flirting with women.
Franklin always had a taste for smart women and always had a taste for intellectual exchange with smart women, as well as a taste for beautiful women.
By all accounts, Catherine Ray, also known as Katie, fit the bill. She met Ben in Boston in 1754. Soon after, they shared a carriage south through New England. The events of that trip remain unclear. The letter Katie wrote to Ben just after no longer survives. Some say Ben himself made sure that it didn't.
I think he tried to make it a romantic relationship, but she resisted. So in the end, like almost all of his other relationships, it's really a flirtation of the mind and of the heart, but not really a romantic relationship. They remain friends for the rest of their lives.
Franklin had women friends in Britain as well. During much of his tenure as a colonial agent in London, Ben took a room at this house on Craven Street. There he enjoyed the company of his landlady, Margaret Stevenson, and her daughter, Polly.
And once again, Franklin develops a very flirtatious relationship with the young woman, also a very intellectual relationship. He writes her about all of his scientific discoveries.
Polly was even among the trusted few who received a letter written in Ben's phonetic alphabet. But there may have been something more between Ben and Polly. This sketch was done in 1767 by a well-known artist after he had stumbled upon Ben and a young lady at Craven Street. The young lady's identity has never been confirmed, though she is said to be none other than Polly Stevenson.
Franklin's relation with Polly Stevenson is a puzzle we will probably never unravel. Likewise, his relation with her mother, Margaret. Whether there was something ongoingly romantic, whether they were living together in anything other than the sense that he was living in her building, who knows?
It is the period between 1776 and 1785, Franklin's stay in France, that has given rise to the most notorious tales about Ben and his girlfriends. By that time, his wife Debbie had died. Ben was on his own.
Franklin and the ladies of Paris has always been an irresistible subject. The question of what he actually wanted from them, what he actually got from them, has tantalized forever.
Soon after arriving in France, Ben moved into a suite of rooms in this chateau in the town of Passy, just outside Paris. Despite appearances, Ben's lifestyle here was far from opulent.
Franklin had probably the most Spartan existence of any diplomat in Paris at the time. Franklin had a household of between 3 and 9 in staff. Most of the diplomats in Paris had upwards of 100. There was no foreigner ever who sat at Franklin's table and complimented him on his sumptuous fare. It was always poor Franklin, his Spartan existence. We had a very simple Republican meal at Dr. Franklin's.
What made Passy so delectable to Ben was the neighborhood. Or, more precisely, the girl next door, Anne-Louise Briand de Jouy.
A woman who is nearly half his age, very beautiful, one of the most beautiful women in Paris. Quite married, the mother of 2 teenage daughters, who adores Franklin.
Madame Briand was known for her musicianship and her artistic temperament, a tendency towards melodramatic moods. It is said that even a few gusts of wind might plunge her into a fit of despondency. Beginning in the spring of 1777, Benjamin Franklin patiently provided comfort to Madame Briand. He called on her twice a week, and they wrote to each other between visits.
It's quite clear that he would have appreciated getting something more in return than simply Madame Briand's witty letters and her kisses.
The longer they spent together, the more drawn they were to one another. And I don't think there's any question that Franklin would have loved it if Madame Briand yielded.
It would certainly seem that Madame Briand was tempted. While we might think along the same lines, she wrote, we must speak and act differently. Perhaps there is no great harm in a man having desires and yielding to them. A woman may have desires, but she must not yield. Rejection, however, only seemed to fuel Ben's passion.
Franklin was very serious in his pursuit of Madame Briand, and he wrote her all sorts of salacious letters trying to entice her into a relationship.
In one note, Franklin refers to his love in words that almost certainly were meant to have a double meaning. My poor little boy, whom you ought to have cherished, instead of being fat and jolly, is starved almost to death for want of the nourishment which you inhumanely deny him. Briand bounced insinuations right back at Ben. The lady advises the gentleman to fatten up his favorite at other tables than hers, which will always offer too meager a diet for his greedy appetites. Though poetically put, the meaning was clear. No.
They finally agreed that he would consider her as a daughter, and she would consider him as a beloved father. She began addressing him as mon cher papa, and he occasionally addressed her as my dear daughter.
Father figure was a role Ben reluctantly assumed with more than one young woman.
Even at his age, because he was always a remarkably vigorous and physical specimen, he probably did have some forlorn hopes that they would respond to his advances, but he always came on as an uncle. He always came on with an easy escape route for them.
That was not the case with another French woman, Anna Catherine Helvetius. A ravishing beauty in her youth, Madame Helvetius was an attractive 50-something widow when she caught Ben's eye in 1778.
She was somewhat bohemian. She had both the qualities of the upper class, but the bohemian nature of somebody who had been raised poor, and he loved that mix in her.
With Madame Helvetius, Franklin was apparently more interested in marriage than lusty adventure. But rather than ask directly, Ben writes her a fanciful story in which he just hints at a proposal.
And that proposal has not always been taken altogether seriously. I see it as a perfectly serious bit of work. She turns him down. But there seems no question that his devotion to her outlasts the flirtation. Even after the return to America, even as he's nearing the end of his life, he's still writing her. And he writes that he still thinks of her in his dreams, and he hopes one day to see her again. And there's a real element of regret there.
In the later years of his life, Ben wrote letters not only to Madame Helvetius, but to Katie, Madame Brillon, and Polly as well. Clearly, he valued his female friends. The friendships, whatever their nature, survived both time and distance. It is no secret, however, that Franklin showed little evidence of such strong connections with his own family. In fact, it is in family matters that Benjamin Franklin would show the most puzzling side of his complex and enigmatic character. It is not a total exaggeration to say that Benjamin Franklin could have charmed just about anyone on the planet. Yet, by all accounts, Ben's charisma vanished when it came to his wife and children. With them, Franklin seems to have been cold and aloof, a virtual stranger in his own family.
I don't know if this means that he didn't value these family relationships, or if he didn't know how to express the feelings that he had.
As a young man, the emotional distance was not so obvious. Ben's affection for his wife, Debbie, and the life they shared was genuine. That would change with time.
Franklin's life is a succession of outgrowing one environment and growing into the next one. At the time Franklin married Debbie, he was a young businessman in Philadelphia trying to get a start. She was a young woman in Philadelphia. Her whole world had been Philadelphia. For 15 or 20 years, Franklin was content to spend nearly all of his time in Philadelphia.
Debbie helped Ben raise his illegitimate son, William. Then, in 1732, Debbie gave birth to a son, Francis. Ben delighted in the miniature perfection of the infant, whom he called Frankie. What curious joints and hinges on which limbs are moved to and fro, he marveled. What an inconceivable variety of nerves, veins, arteries, fibers, and little invisible parts. When Frankie was 4, a ghastly mistake would bring Ben's fatherly exuberance to a sudden end.
Franklin had for years been an advocate of inoculation against smallpox, but one thing and another, including the demands of business, had prevented him from inoculating Frankie. So when smallpox came through that season, it swept away Frankie. And Franklin always felt this certain guilt about that.
After that, Franklin does become a little bit emotionally detached, walled off from the rest of his family. I think it was a searing event, and even years later he wrote his sister saying he couldn't think of his young son Frankie without tears welling in his eyes.
7 years after Frankie's death, Ben and Debbie had a second child, Sarah. But Sally, as she was called, seems little more than a footnote to her father's illustrious life. From the time Sally was 12 until she was 39, more than a quarter century, Ben spent just over 3 years in America. He even chose to stay in London when Sally was married. Yet, she remained devoted.
Sally's his daughter is always trying to do things to please him, and he's very grudging in his praise.
Perhaps Sally's most poignant attempt to win her father's approval came during his years in Paris.
Sally decides to make some silk and present it to him to give to the Queen of France because she wanted to show the industriousness in America and American products and help our French allies. And Franklin's totally dismissive, sort of saying, how can you give, think that you should give something to the Queen of France?
Ben apparently refrained from such harsh comments in letters to his wife. His absence, however, spoke volumes. Ben was in London, away from Debbie, for nearly 20 years of their marriage.
His horizons broadened. He outgrew Philadelphia. He grew into this larger sphere. Debbie refused to join him in London. She knew she would have been way out of place in London. She wouldn't have been comfortable. She would have done a disservice to herself, and in a certain sense, she would have done a disservice to her husband. So she stays home.
If Franklin felt a pang of homesickness, it melted away under the care of the Stevensons on Craven Street. It was a home away from home, with the added spice, perhaps, of romance.
Franklin has a funny kind of ready-made family approach. He tends to fall in love with whole families, not necessarily his own. And there's a real distance there with his own family. And if he could be said to have a great failing, I think it's probably in his family relations that it's most clear.
No matter what might be happening at home, Ben preferred to stay in London. Even a family emergency couldn't lure him back. November 1769. Debbie suffers a stroke. In a letter to Ben, she attributes her illness to their separation, calling it dissatisfied distress. I was unable to bear any more, she writes, and so I fell and could not get up again.
The fact that he knows his wife of many years is ill, he knows that she wants him to come home, and he doesn't really speak well of Franklin's attachment to this relationship.
Deborah Franklin died just before Christmas 1774. She hadn't seen her husband in more than 7 years. Perhaps the most complex of Ben's family relationships was with his first son, William.
For most of both of their lives, Benjamin and William Franklin were not only father and son, but friends, political allies, confidants.
It was William who assisted Ben with the now legendary kite experiment in 1752, an experiment conducted in total secrecy. Though many illustrations show William as a young boy, he was in fact in his early 20s. In the decades that followed, father and son grew ever closer.
They traveled together, they went to the frontier together, and he even brings William to England together when he becomes an envoy of the colonies over in England.
While in Britain, William fathered his own illegitimate son, Temple Franklin. The birth of Temple, Ben's first grandchild, was kept secret. Ben assumed responsibility for the boy with William's consent.
They saw eye to eye on most important issues. They were business partners. William and Benjamin were involved in a plan to gain land grants in the Ohio Valley. Benjamin Franklin was responsible for William's appointment as Royal Governor of New Jersey. So each one was promoting the career of the other. And there was this sort of family business. People sometimes criticized it, almost a family conspiracy. The small Franklin Mafia was working to promote the interests of the Franklin family. They were that close.
In the end, however, Ben's decision to embrace the revolution would tear them apart.
When he comes back to America, right as the revolution has begun, his first meeting is with his son, William. And he tells his son that he's going to become a rebel. He's going to join the cause of independence. He's going to become a patriot on the American cause. And he asks William to resign as royal governor of New Jersey and join the cause. But William won't. William stays loyal to the crown. And what you have is a personal split that mirrors the political split between the mother country and the colonies.
The bitter split soon extends to include William's son, Temple, then 15.
There's a struggle for the soul of this kid between Benjamin Franklin and William. And back and forth, Temple goes from New Jersey to Pennsylvania throughout 1775 until finally he sides with Benjamin Franklin, his grandfather, and becomes a revolutionary.
There is more bitterness to come. In March of 1776, William learns that his father is part of a secret American mission heading to Canada to enlist support for the revolution. William passes the information to his British superiors, who apparently mobilize soldiers to intervene.
Franklin learned about this. He became exceedingly hurt, and it became impossible for Franklin to forgive William. It's difficult to know where to pin the blame for this. I'm not even sure blame is the right word.
After Washington's victory at Yorktown, there was little to keep William in America. He left for England in 1782. His final meeting with Ben came in July of 1785. Ben stopped in Britain on his way home from France. His arrival was preceded by a letter. "Nothing has ever hurt me so much as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son," Ben wrote William. "I ought not to blame your differing in sentiment with me in public affairs, though there are natural duties which precede political ones and cannot be extinguished by them." The hurried meeting between Ben and William is a disaster. There is no compromise, no forgiveness, no reconciliation.
William won't apologize for what he has done. Franklin, of course, won't apologize for what he has done. Each one believes that the other ought to be the one making the apologies. These two strong-headed men, Franklin now is nearly 80, William is in his 50s. These are full-grown men, and each one has a very firm sense of his own rectitude, and they simply can't get back together.
Franklin has put up a wall, and there's absolutely no crossing that wall at this point. He'll write his son essentially out of his will, and he washes his hands of him.
All in all, Benjamin Franklin appears painfully ungifted as a husband and father, though he did spend his later years living with his daughter Sally. Whatever his personal shortcomings, Franklin's legacy as a founding father shines with his customary brilliance. As much as George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, it is Ben Franklin who would see the vision, speak the wisdom, and set the examples that shape the personality of the United States, even today. When Benjamin Franklin returned from France in 1785, he was greeted as a hero. Franklin was finally home to stay, and the people of Philadelphia shouted their respect from every street corner. Whatever attentions Ben had withheld from his family, he lavished on his country. Few had done more for America. Perhaps Ben's greatest contributions were his ideas, bedrock beliefs upon which the United States has stood for more than 200 years. In fact, the very notion of a United States can be partly credited to Ben Franklin. Ben first pitched the idea in the Pennsylvania Gazette. In 1754, he published this illustration that urged the colonies to unite for the common good. It is widely considered the first political cartoon in American history. More than 2 decades later, the rest of the country would come around to Ben's point of view. On July 4th, 1776, the colonies finally decided to join or die. The Declaration of Independence enshrined another bedrock American value, the separation of church and state. Here, too, Ben led the way.
Congress creates a committee in order to write the Declaration of Independence. In fact, it may be the last time Congress created a really good committee, because it has John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin on it.
Once Jefferson completes a draft, he presents it to Adams and Franklin for review.
Franklin looks at that second paragraph, that famous second paragraph, and Jefferson has written, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." And you see the heavy backslashes of Franklin's printer's pen in which he crosses it out, and he writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And his point is that our rights come from the consent of the governed, from rationality and from reason, not from the dictates or dogma of any particular religion. And what we have is a separation of church and state, and how they have to be kept separate.
America had cut itself free from the dictates of both church and royalty. Yet the individual states still jealously guarded their own power, just as they had as colonies. In 1781, they grudgingly agreed to a national government, but it was toothless, ineffective, and doomed to failure.
The Articles of Confederation did not allow for a strong enough central government. It couldn't even impose taxes. So after a while, they needed to have a constitutional convention so they could start revising the Articles, and what they end up doing is throwing them out totally and writing a whole new constitution.
May 1787. The Constitutional Convention assembles in Philadelphia. At 81, Benjamin Franklin is the oldest of the delegates. He had served in these very halls as a Pennsylvania assemblyman when many of his colleagues had been young enough for diapers. Now, from his perch in the midst of the debate, Ben watched as the younger generation became hopelessly deadlocked on a vital issue, each state's representation in a national Congress. Not surprisingly, it was Ben who offered up a solution.
Benjamin Franklin gets up and he says, "I'm older than the rest of you, and the older I get, the more I realize I'm fallible, that I've made some mistakes in my time. And you should realize that you're fallible too, and perhaps the person next to you, their opinion is just as valid as your own."
As he often did, he couched his recommendation in a homely little anecdote. And he said, "When I arrange for a carpenter to build me a table, a dining room table, this carpenter will have 2 or 3 pieces of wood. And the pieces of wood won't fit perfectly together.
You shave a little from one side, and you take a little from the other, until soon you have a joint that will hold together for centuries. And so, too, we here at this convention must each part with some of our demands if we're going to have a constitution that will hold together for centuries."
Franklin urged a compromise, a legislature of 2 houses, which we now know as the Senate and the House of Representatives. In one, states would have equal representation. In the other, seats would be apportioned by population.
It was absolutely important for the large states and the small states to feel that they had a stake in this. And Franklin's recommendation for compromise was absolutely essential in giving both the large states and the small states a sense that this is going to promote their interest.
The proposal was accepted and written into the Constitution of the United States, perhaps the most successful system of government ever devised. Yet again, Ben Franklin had played a critical role. 200 years later, his remarkable achievements continue to define the American landscape. On January 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin marked his 84th birthday. He was suffering from pleurisy and kidney stones, and sometimes resorted to opium to ease the pain. In early spring, Ben took to bed. After 8 decades, America's marvelous guiding spirit was fading. Among those surrounding Ben during the final days were his daughter Sally and his grandson Temple. Ben's old friend Polly Stevenson, now a middle-aged mother, came from England to see him off. Benjamin Franklin died on April 17, 1790. His funeral procession would be a testament to the ideals he had lived by.
Franklin was the exemplar of tolerance above all. And it's seen at his funeral, where instead of just his minister accompanying the casket to the grave, all 35 ministers and preachers and priests of Philadelphia, from the Presbyterians to the Lutherans to the Catholics to the Quakers to the Rabbi of the Jews, all march arm in arm with his casket as he's being carried to the grave.
Every biographer basically brings his subject into his home for a while. Franklin was the most wonderful house guest. And biographers probably aren't supposed to admit this, but I really did shed a tear when Franklin died. I was really sorry to see him go.
Benjamin Franklin, however, is still very much with us. At the time this program was produced, a Google search on Ben would rack up almost 3.5 million hits. Less than half as many as George Washington, but a lot more than Abraham Lincoln. Or even Mick Jagger. Cities, schools, colleges, streets, businesses, and even 2 presidents, Franklin Pierce and Franklin Roosevelt, have been named after Ben. A steady stream of books and souvenirs continues the fad that long ago raged through Paris. There is even a Ben Franklin action figure. Ben's final resting place has long been a pilgrimage site. In the late 1800s, brides bound for the altar would stop to toss a penny on his grave for good luck. Some 70 years after Ben's death, a section of the cemetery wall near his grave was replaced with wrought iron fencing. Ever since, Ben has been accessible 24/7. Even today, visitors leave offerings of pennies, not unlike the notes and tokens left for saints around the world.
He's the founding father you can really relate to. You got people like Washington who are up there in marble on some pedestal and you're scared to go near them or touch them. But Franklin is the patron saint of the common person.
Jefferson, Washington, those members of the founding generation stand above and apart from everybody else. With Franklin, he's right there on a busy street corner in Philadelphia. And he seems to be one of us in a way that most of the other members of the founding generation were not.
Not everyone has wanted to be like Ben. Mark Twain, himself a master of parody, was one of many who took a good-natured shot at Ben's autobiography. He was always proud of telling how he entered Philadelphia for the first time, noted Twain, with nothing in the world but 2 shillings in his pocket, 4 rolls of bread under his arm. But really, when you come to examine it critically, it was nothing. Anybody could have done it. As for Franklin himself, he remains, in the end, something of a mystery. What are we to make of a man who had 1,000 faces? A man who fit in both with royalty and with tradesmen, who was equally comfortable addressing Parliament or whispering to Parisian ladies. A man who passed up a fortune so that 1 million strangers would be safe from lightning, yet slammed the door on his only surviving son.
I think Franklin became so benevolent, so wondrously Ben, that he was trapped not in a role, but in the proliferation of roles. And he mystifies everybody who tries to study him. There's one of his biographers who speculated that Franklin might be the only person in human history without an unconscious, that there was no inner life, there is no deep Franklin, there is no secret Franklin. And I think that the biographers have felt this, that he's a wraith, he's a ghost. He flits out of their grasp just when they think they have him. So they have recourse to things like his vast curiosity, but that's just a cover for saying we don't know what makes him tick.